I have spent 40 years writing down the weather because nobody believes a man who only speaks it. You learn things, keeping a journal of sky. You learn that a cold front has a smell, copper and wet stone, and that the smell comes a day before the cloud. You learn that animals are not wiser than men, only more honest. A horse will tell you its fear plainly where a man will swallow his and call it courage. And you learn, if you live long enough out here, that the worst disasters do not arrive as surprises. They arrive as warnings that nobody wanted to hear. I am going to tell you about a man who was thrown out of his own people for being right too early. His name, the part of it I'm allowed to write, was Dasoda, though the soldiers butchered it into Dawson, and the Apache he was born among called him something I will not put on paper, because it became a curse in their mouths before it became a blessing. I met him in the autumn of a year I'd rather not date, on the broken country between the Chiricahua high ground and the flats where my cattle starved. I was a rancher then, and a poor one, and I thought I understood hardship. I did not. I want you to sit with one thing before I begin, because the whole story turns on it. There is a particular loneliness that belongs only to the person who sees the storm coming and cannot make anyone look up. It is worse than the storm. The storm, at least, eventually agrees with you. By then it is too late for agreement to matter, and you are left standing in the wreckage you predicted, holding the awful, useless gift of having been right. That was Dasoda's whole life, until the winter that proved him. So here is my promise to you, and I keep my promises the way I keep my weather logs, carefully and without flourish. Stay with me through 3 turns of this story: the exile, the digging, and the night the snow came down like the sky had finally decided to answer him. By the end you will understand why an old white rancher still cannot speak this man's name without his throat closing, and why I believe, God help me, I do believe it, that being right is sometimes the cruelest thing that can happen to a good man. Let me start where it started for me, with a fight I didn't understand in a language I didn't speak, over a thing I couldn't see. The first time I saw Dasoda, 3 men were dragging him out of a wickiup by his arms, and an old woman was throwing his belongings into the dirt after him. I had ridden up the wrong wash looking for a strayed heifer, a stupid, stubborn animal that had cost me half a day already, and I came over a low ridge of catclaw and ocotillo straight into the edge of a camp I had no business being near. I knew enough to freeze. A man alone, on a horse, at the edge of an Apache rancheria in those years, was a man with a short and unpleasant future if he moved wrong. So I sat very still in my saddle and I watched. And what I watched did not look like anything I'd been taught to expect from people I'd been taught to fear. It looked like a family falling apart. The man on the ground, Dasoda, though I wouldn't have his name for weeks yet, did not fight back. That was the first thing that struck me. He was not a small man. He had the kind of forearms that come from a lifetime of work and a chest like a barrel, and he could have hurt the men dragging him. He chose not to. He let them haul him out into the open, and he sat up in the dirt and he kept talking. Low, urgent, steady. Not pleading, explaining. Over and over, the same shape of words, to people who had clearly stopped hearing them a long time before I arrived. A young man, his son, I'd learned, stood off to the side with his arms crossed so tight it looked like he was holding his own ribs in. He would not look at his father. He looked at the mountains instead, the high blue spine of them to the north, and his jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. The old woman kept throwing things: a water basket, a bundle of dried something, a child's small bow, half finished, which made me think there was a grandchild in this somewhere, and that made the whole scene worse. She was weeping while she did it. That's the detail I have never been able to shake. She was casting him out, and she was sobbing the entire time. And I understood, even from the ridge, even across the gulf of everything I didn't know, that this was a woman doing a thing she hated because she believed she had no choice. Dasoda finally stopped talking. He got to his feet. He gathered what he could of what she'd thrown, slow and dignified, and he looked at the young man one last time. The sun did not turn, and Dasoda walked out of the camp on the south side, away from the mountains, toward the bad country, toward me, with his back straight and his hands full of broken baskets, and not one person watched him go. Except the old woman and me. I backed my horse off the ridge before anyone saw the second witness, and I went home without my heifer, and I wrote 4 lines in my journal that night that I can still recite. Saw a man cast out today. Did not understand why. He carried himself like a man who had lost an argument, not a fight. There is a difference, and I do not know how I know it. I found out the why because I'm a nosy man, and because loneliness makes a person reckless. It was 2 weeks later. The nights had started to bite early, too early, and I'd noticed it in my own bones before I noticed it in my logs. I keep a thermometer my brother sent me from back east, a fine brass thing I'm absurdly proud of, and it was reading lows that didn't belong to the calendar. Frost on the water trough in a month that had no business frosting. The cottonwoods turning and dropping in the space of a week instead of a month. I'd written it down the way I write everything down, and I'd felt that old familiar itch at the back of my neck. The copper and whetstone feeling. Something's coming. I came across Dasoda by the river, building. He'd set himself up at the base of a limestone bluff a good 4 miles south of the rancheria that had cast him out, far enough to be exiled, close enough that I think he couldn't bear to be truly gone. And he was digging. He had a fire-hardened stick and a flat shoulder blade of some big animal lashed to a handle, and he was attacking the soft rock and packed earth at the foot of the bluff like a man possessed. I watched him for a while from cover the way I had at the camp. He worked in a rhythm. Dig, clear, dig, clear. He'd stop and press his palm flat against the stone like he was listening to it. Then he'd move 2 feet over and start again, choosing his spot by some logic I couldn't read. He had blisters that had broken and bled and dried and broken again. I could see the dark stains on the handle of his digging tool. He didn't stop for them. I'm not a brave man. I want that understood. But I am a curious one, and curiosity has got me into more trouble than courage ever could have. So I rode out into the open, slow, hands where he could see them, and I said the only Apache word I knew, which was a greeting I'd learned from a trader and probably mangled. He looked up. He did not reach for a weapon, though I saw a knife at his belt. He just looked at me, this big tired man with bleeding hands and gray coming into his hair, and he said, in slow, careful, trader pidgin Spanish and English and something else, "You feel it too." It wasn't a question. He'd seen my breath fogging. He'd seen me hunch into my coat. He'd watched the same frost I'd watched. "The cold," I said. "Yeah, it's early." "Not early." He went back to digging. "On time, everyone else is late." I came back the next day with a real shovel, and I didn't ask permission to help. I just got down off my horse and started clearing rock where he'd loosened it. He watched me for a minute, deciding something, and then he accepted it the way you accept rain, without thanks, without comment, just by making room. We didn't talk much that first day of working together, but over the weeks that followed in that broken pigeon we cobbled together between us, the story came out of him in pieces, the way a splinter works its way out of skin, slowly, and with some pain. He was a reader of weather. That was his gift in his band, the thing he'd been respected for, the role he'd held since he was younger than his son was now. He read the high clouds and the behavior of the deer and the early hard seeds on the junipers and the way the ants had been building their mounds tall and steep all summer. He read the cold that came in August nights and didn't leave. He read all of it, the way I read my brass thermometer and my logs, except he held it all in his head and his body, a lifetime of pattern, and what every part of him was screaming was the same thing. This winter is going to kill us. Not a hard winter, not a cold one. A killing one, the kind that comes maybe twice in a long life, the kind the old people only half remembered and mostly through the names of those it had taken. Deep snow in country that rarely saw deep snow. Game driven down or frozen out. Cold that would find every gap in every shelter and crawl in and lie down beside the children. And he had stood up in front of his band, and he had told them. He told them they could not winter where they always wintered, in the brush shelters in the canyon that had served their grandfathers. He told them the canyon would fill with snow and they would be trapped in it. He told them they needed to dig, to go into the earth, into the rock, where the cold could not reach so easily, where a fire could be kept and the stone itself would hold the warmth. He had seen such a place once far to the north, abandoned dwellings cut into a cliff by people long gone, and he had understood why those vanished people had built that way. The earth keeps its own warmth. He told them all of this. And they had laughed at him. Then they had argued with him. Then when he would not stop, when he kept bringing it up, kept warning, kept pushing, kept being the man who would not let them rest in their certainty, they had grown afraid of him. Or afraid of what he was saying, which can feel like the same thing. His own son led the faction against him. That was the wound that wouldn't close. The boy was young and ambitious, and he had a child of his own now, and he could not afford in front of the band to be the son of the man who had become a bad omen. So he'd argued loudest. He'd called his father's gift a sickness. He'd said Dasoda was an old man frightened of a winter like any other winter, spreading his fear like a contagion, and that the band could not move its whole life on the word of one frightened old man's dreams. And the band had agreed with the son, because the son was offering them what they wanted, which was permission to do nothing, to stay, to trust the canyon that had always held them. So they cast Dasoda out, not for being wrong, for the unforgivable crime of insisting he was right. "Why are you still here?" I asked him that evening when the light was going amber and long and our shadows reached all the way to the river. We had cleared a space at the foot of the bluff maybe big enough to crawl into. It was nothing yet, a scrape, a start. He sat back on his heels and he wiped his ruined hands on his thighs and he looked, not at me, but north, toward the canyon, toward the people who had thrown his belongings into the dirt. "If I leave," he said slowly, "and I am wrong, then I am only an old fool who ran from a winter and froze somewhere alone. That is a small thing. The world is full of old fools." He picked up a chip of limestone and turned it over in his fingers. "But if I leave," he went on, "and I am right and they die in that canyon because I was not here," he stopped. His jaw did the same thing his sons had done, that bitter chewing. Then what was the gift for? Why give a man eyes only so he can walk away from what he sees? I didn't have an answer. I'm a rancher. I don't traffic in answers like that. "They threw me out," he said very quietly, and now he did look at me and his eyes were wet and furious and exhausted all at once. "They did not throw out the cold. The cold is still coming. The cold does not care that I am exiled." He turned the limestone chip once more and then he threw it hard at the bluff where it cracked and fell. "So I will dig the place I told them to dig, and when the snow comes it will be here, and they will know where it is." "You think they'll come to you," I said, "after all that?" He went back to digging. The light failed slowly. The first stars came out, cold and very sharp, the way they only are when winter is leaning on the door. "I think," he said, not stopping, "that hunger and cold make better arguments than I ever could. Dig, clear, dig. I am only making sure the argument has somewhere to lead them." I rode home in the dark that night and I sat up late by my own fire, and I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because the whole point of keeping a true record is that it has to be true even when it's ugly. I felt afraid, not of him, of the thing he was so certain of, because I had my brass thermometer and my own logs and my own copper and whetstone neck hitch, and every instrument I owned, including the one made of meat and instinct in my own chest, was telling me the exact same thing his lifetime of pattern was telling him. I believed him. God help me, I believed him completely. And I understood, sitting there, why they'd cast him out, because belief like that is a terrible thing to be near. It demands something of you. It will not let you rest in the easy certainty that things will be the way they've always been. I wrote in my journal that night, "He is right. I would stake my herd and my life on it. And he has no one to dig with but a stranger he can barely talk to and a winter that does not negotiate. Then I added a line I almost scratched out, and I'm glad now that I didn't. Tomorrow I bring my mules and my good iron tools. If the world won't help him dig, I will. A man should not have to be right all alone. We had 31 days. I know because I counted them backward later from the night it broke, and because I marked each one in the margin of my log with a small dark slash, the way a prisoner marks a wall. I didn't know then how few we had. I only knew that every morning was colder than the morning before, and that the cold had a determination to it, a will that turned the work from a project into a fight. We dug like the dying. That first week, it was just the two of us and my 2 mules and a borrowed second shovel. The limestone at the bluff was soft enough to work where it was rotten and hard as a banker's heart where it wasn't, and Dasota chose our path through it by that listening trick of his, palm flat to the stone, head cocked, finding the seams where the rock would give. He was right almost every time. Where he said dig, the earth came away in clods and chunks. Where he said don't, my iron bar would have shattered against the face. The plan, as I came to understand it, was not a cave so much as a warren. He wasn't hollowing out one big room. He explained this to me with sticks scratched in the dirt one evening, frustrated by the limits of our shared handful of words. One big room would be cold. The air in it would have nowhere to gather warmth, and it would suck the heat off a fire and off bodies and give nothing back. What he wanted was small. A low, narrow entrance, a crawl almost, a tunnel a person had to go down into on their hands and knees, because cold air sinks and a low door traps the warm air inside like water in a cupped hand. And then beyond the entrance, chambers. Several of them small, dug back into the bluff, each one big enough for a few people to lie close, each one connected so the warmth of one fire and many bodies could move between them, but the killing wind never could. He had seen the bones of this idea in those abandoned cliff dwellings up north, and his whole life of reading cold had filled in the rest. The earth keeps its warmth. Go deep enough and the ground itself is the same temperature winter and summer, a steady cool that, with a fire and bodies, becomes survivable. Above ground, in the brush shelters in the canyon, you fought the cold with nothing between you and it but woven branches. Below ground, the mountain fought it for you. It was, I understood slowly, a brilliant thing. The kind of brilliance that comes not from cleverness but from a lifetime of paying attention to something everyone else takes for granted. And he was building it alone, with a stranger, 4 miles from everyone it was meant to save. The work broke us down and remade us. My hands, which I'd thought were a working man's hands, blistered and bled like a boy's. Dasota's were already past blistering. They'd gone to callus and crack, the splits in them opening with every swing and weeping in the cold until he packed them with some sapandash paste he made and kept on. We worked until we couldn't see, and then we worked by feel, and then we'd collapse by the fire at the cave mouth and eat whatever I'd brought from the ranch and whatever he'd snared, and we'd say almost nothing, because we were too tired and because everything that mattered had already been said. I learned things about him in the silences. He talked in his sleep, to his son mostly, the same low, urgent explaining I'd seen the first day, the argument he was still having in his dreams with a boy who wouldn't listen. He had a small thing he carried, a child's carved bird, rough-made, the kind a man makes for a grandchild. He'd take it out sometimes when he thought I wasn't watching and turn it over the way he'd turned that limestone chip and put it away again. I never asked. Some splinters you let a man keep. In the second week, the first of them came. It was the old woman, the one who'd wept and thrown his belongings in the dirt. She came down the South Wash on a thin pony with a bundle behind her, and she sat at the edge of our firelight the way I'd first sat at the edge of theirs, not coming closer, not leaving. Dasota looked up from the cave mouth, and the two of them regarded each other for a long, long time, and nobody said a word. Then she got down off the pony and she walked to the pile of tools, and she picked up the spare shovel, and she started to dig. She was his sister. I learned that later. She had cast him out with her own hands because the band had demanded it, and because to refuse would have been to be cast out alongside him, and she had a daughter and grandchildren in that band, and she could not abandon them on the word of a brother she half believed. So she had thrown his things in the dirt and wept the whole time, and then she had gone back to the canyon and lain awake every night since, feeling the same cold he felt, watching the same frost, and losing the same argument with her own certainty that I had lost with mine. She had come because she could no longer stand not knowing if he was right. She dug beside him without a word of apology, and he accepted it without a word of forgiveness, and I understood that between them this was the apology and was the forgiveness, all of it, the whole thing, said in the language of shared labor toward a shared survival. Some people say sorry. Some people just pick up the second shovel. After her they trickled in. Not many, not at first. A young couple with a sick baby who'd run out of other ideas. An old man whose joints, he said, had never lied to him about weather and were screaming now. A widow and her 2 near-grown sons. They came down the wash in 1s and 2s, ashamed and frightened and stubborn, and they did not announce that they'd changed their minds, because changing your mind in front of people is a kind of dying. They just showed up and they dug. And the work changed. With 6 hands it had been desperate. With 16, with 20 it became something else. It became possible. The chambers took shape. The low crawl-down entrance got dug and then got lined with flat stones. Dasoda directed it all, and the thing I watched happen in him over those days was the thing I have never forgotten, and the reason I am writing any of this down at all. He did not gloat. He had been cast out, humiliated, called sick and cursed, and now the cast out were crawling back to him hollow-eyed with fear, and he did not say I told you so even once. Not once. I watched for it, ashamed of myself, because I think I wanted him to. I wanted him to have that. But he just put the shovels in their hands and showed them where to dig and fed them at his fire, and never, ever, made a single one of them grovel for the help they were ashamed to need. He understood something I'm still learning, that being right does not entitle you to make other people pay for having been wrong. The winter would extract payment enough. His job was the opposite. His job was to make sure the payment wasn't death. But his son did not come, and his son had the most people. That was the heavy thing, the morally heavy thing, the impossible thing, the thing I watched eat him alive in the 3rd week even as the shelter grew. His son still held the canyon, and the son still had with him more than half the band, the families who'd sided with the easy answer, the ones who'd staked everything on the canyon holding the way it always had. Among them was Dasoda's grandchild. The owner, I understood at last, of the half-finished bow his sister had thrown in the dirt, and the rough little carved bird he turned over in his hands at night. The shelter we were building could not hold everyone. That was the brutal arithmetic of it. We had 31 days and stone that fought us and a limited number of bodies to dig, and the warren could hold maybe 40 souls packed tight if we worked every hour we had. The band was near 80. Every chamber we finished was a chamber that would hold some. Never all. So Dasoda had to choose. Not out loud. Not in any way he ever admitted. But every day he had to decide whether to send one of us, me, on a fast horse, up the canyon to plead with his son one more time, knowing each plea would be thrown back in his face, knowing each refusal would cut him fresh, or whether to save the breath and the time and the heart blood and just dig, and let the canyon make its own grave. He sent me up the canyon 4 times. 4 times I rode up to that brush shelter camp and stood at its edge and called out Dasoda's message in my mangled words, with the old man's sister sometimes riding with me to add her voice. Come down. Come to the cave. There is room, there is warmth. There is your father, your brother, your kin, waiting with no anger, with only an open door. And 4 times the son came out and stood with his arms crossed over his ribs the way I'd seen him the first day. And 4 times he refused, and the refusals got colder each time, to match the air. The 4th time, the son said something to me that the sister translated in a flat, dead voice on the ride back down. He'd said, "Tell the old man that if his winter does not come, he can never return. And if it does come, I will not give him the satisfaction of saving me. I have thought about that sentence for 40 years. I will not give him the satisfaction of saving me. I have decided it is the most human and the most terrible thing I have ever heard. The boy would rather freeze than admit his father had seen what he could not. He would rather die right than live wrong. And he was going to take his own child, Dasota's grandchild, down into that frozen pride with him. I told Dasota what his son had said. I had to. I couldn't carry it alone. He didn't say anything for a long time. He was sitting at the cave mouth with the little carved bird in his split, bleeding hands, and the first hard flakes of the year were just beginning to drift down out of a low gray sky, fat and slow and almost gentle, the way the worst ones always start. "We dig faster," he finally said. His voice didn't break, that was the worst part. It would have been easier if it had broken. "We finish the last chamber, we make it big enough." He looked up at the snow coming down. "Big enough for the ones who come late, big enough for the ones who come at the very last moment when they are too cold to be proud anymore." He closed his hand around the wooden bird. "Pride freezes before the body does. I have to leave the door open long enough for it to thaw." The snow kept falling. It did not stop falling for 3 days and 3 nights. It had come, exactly as he said it would, to the day, to the bone. He had been right. And being right meant his son was somewhere up that canyon in the rising white, choosing pride with a child in his arms. We dug, God, how we dug. The storm did not come like weather. It came like a verdict. By the end of the first day, the snow was past my knees on the flats and drifting to my waist where the wind funneled it. And the wind was the thing none of us were ready for, even Dasota, even me with all my logs. It came down off the high country with a sound like the world tearing, and it carried the snow sideways, and it found every gap and every weakness, and where it found a person unsheltered, it did not so much chill them as erase them. I have never been so cold. I have never been so afraid of the simple physical fact of cold, the way it stops being an inconvenience and becomes a hand around your throat. Inside the warren, it was a different world. This is the thing I most need you to understand, because it is the proof of everything, the vindication written in the one language the band had finally been forced to read. Down the low crawl entrance, past the flat stone-lined throat of the thing, in the connected chambers dug back into the living rock, it was warm. Not warm like summer, warm like life. The fire at the central hearth burned steady and its smoke drew up and out through a vent Dasota had cut at exactly the right angle, and the heat of it and the heat of 40 packed bodies soaked into the stone, and the stone gave it back, and the killing wind howled past the mouth of the shelter and could not get in. The earth kept its warmth. He had been right about that too. He had been right about all of it. 40 souls. We'd finished room enough for 40, working until the last hour before the snow closed the world, and 40 had come, the sister, the sick baby that was not sick anymore in the warmth, the old man with the honest joints, the widow and her sons, all the ashamed ones who'd trickled in, plus a handful more who'd come stumbling down the wash in the first hours of the storm, when the canyon brush shelters started to fail. But not the son, not the grandchild, not the half of the band that had stayed up the canyon in the place that had always held them and was now, we all knew, filling with snow exactly as Dasoda had warned a lifetime of days ago. He went out into it. I tried to stop him. I want that on the record. I grabbed his arm at the mouth of the shelter on the second night, the worst night, when the wind was a solid screaming wall of white, and a man could not see his own hand. And I told him he would die, that he could not even find the canyon in this, that he had done enough, that he had saved 40 people and no one alive could call him anything but right and good, and that going out there was not bravery, it was grief wearing bravery's coat. He looked at me, this big tired old man with his ruined hands and his snow-crusted hair, and he pressed the little carved bird into my palm and closed my fingers over it. "You keep your records," he said, the most words of English I ever heard him put together. "If I do not come back, you write what it was for." And then he went out into the white. with a rope tied around his waist and the other end tied to the stone at the cave mouth, and the sister paying it out hand over hand, and he was swallowed up before he'd gone 10 feet. We waited. The rope went out and out and out to its end, and then it went slack, and we could not tell if that meant he'd reached something or if it meant he'd fallen, and the snow was burying the line. The sister held it and would not let go, and her hands bled into the hemp, and she sang something low and broken the whole time, a sound I have never heard before or since, the sound of a person bargaining with a storm. He came back at dawn on the third day, when the wind finally broke. He came back on his hands and knees, frostbitten, snowblind, more dead than alive, hauling himself down the rope hand over agonized hand, and he was not alone. He had his grandchild against his chest, inside his own clothing, wrapped in his own body heat, a small living weight, and behind him, following the rope he'd anchored across the impossible distance, came 11 more. 11 out of the half a band that had stayed. The ones who'd survived the canyon long enough for their pride to freeze and thaw, exactly as he'd said it would. The ones who'd been clinging to the failing brush shelters when an old exiled man appeared out of the killing white like something out of the old stories, with a rope and a direction, and the simple, unkillable insistence that there was a warm place and he would take them to it. 11 and a child, out of 40 who'd stayed. His son was not among them. I learned the shape of it later in pieces from the 11. The son had held out longest. The son had been the last to break in the deepest part of the storm, and when his own father reached him, when DASODA crawled into that collapsing snow-buried shelter and found his boy with the grandchild already going still and blue in his arms, the son had not been able to walk. Frostbite had taken his feet. He'd given his child to his father. He'd tied his child into his father's clothing with his own freezing hands. And then he had cut himself loose from the rope, because there were others still alive in that shelter who could walk if someone led them, and the line could only guide so many, and a man who could not walk on the rope was a man who would stop everyone behind him. I will not give him the satisfaction of saving me. He kept his word, he would not be saved, but he made sure his child was. The boy chose at the very end to let his father be right, and could not bear to live to say it out loud. So he sent the proof down the rope in the shape of a grandchild, and stayed behind in the snow, and that is the kind of pride that I do not know whether to call a sin or a sacrifice, and I have decided after 40 years that it was both, and that being both is what it means to be a person. DASODA lived. He lost 2 fingers and the sight in one eye, and he was never strong again, but he lived, and the grandchild lived, and 51 souls in all came out of that warren when the snow finally melted off the flats 3 weeks later and they could dig their way to open sky. 51 people who would have died in the canyon. 51 people who lived because one man could not stop being right, and would not be made cruel by it, and left the door open even for the ones who'd cursed him. He didn't gloat. I keep coming back to that. When the survivors crawled up out of the warren into the white silent world and saw the canyon, saw what had become of the place they'd insisted would hold them, not one of them spoke, and DASODA, blind in one eye and short 2 fingers and holding his grandchild's hand, did not say a single word about it. He'd earned every word. He said none. He just looked north at the canyon, where his son was under the snow. And then he looked down at the child. And the child, I watched this, I will swear to it on anything you put in front of me. The child reached up and touched the empty place where the 2 fingers had been, gently, the way children touch the things that frighten them to make them less frightening. And DASODA made a sound, not a word, a sound, and he picked the child up, the way he must once have picked up the boy who would grow into the son who would not be saved, and he held on. I have his carved bird still. He never asked for it back, and I never offered, and I think we both understood why. It sits on the shelf above my writing desk, beside 40 years of weather logs, and when people ask me, the few I ever tell, why an old rancher keeps a child's rough carved bird where other men keep their crucifixes, I tell them it is to remind me of a thing I learned the winter the sky finally answered a man it had been ignoring his whole life. I learned that the loneliest thing in the world is to see the storm coming and have no one look up. And I learned that the bravest thing in the world is to dig the shelter anyway, for the ones who believe you, and for the ones who don't, and to leave the door open longest of all for the ones who cursed your name, because their pride will freeze before their bodies do, and a good man's only job, his only one, is to make sure the warmth is still there when it finally thaws. The grandchild grew up. I see her sometimes, even now. She is old herself now, and she has children, and her children have children, and not one of them has ever spent a winter in a canyon that fills with snow. There were words I meant to end this with, something fitting, something that would tie it off clean. But DASODA never said I told you so, in all that cold, to all those people who'd thrown him away. So I won't either.